I invite you to join us now. We take a peek into the future we create with our keynote for the day. Dr. M. Sanjayan is an accomplished conservation scientist, documentary host, and leader in global conservation efforts. As the former CEO of Conservation International, he oversaw a global organization with a presence in over 100 countries. He holds a master's degree from the University of Oregon and a PhD in conservation biology from the University of California. A respected voice in environmental storytelling, he has hosted more than a dozen award-winning documentaries for major networks including PBC, BBC, and National Geographic. Dr. Sanjayan turns the climate crisis on its head, where nature isn't the victim, but the ultimate technology for our shared purpose. When we invited Dr. Sanjayan, he left Sri Lanka when he was a kid, 5-year-old kid. He had traveled all around the world and now accepted our invitation to be part of Big Bold Brave all the way from USA. Thank you so much. And the stage is yours.
Glaciers melting.
The irreversibly worst pollution of the year.
Species will become extinct.
Sea levels rising.
So what should the world do? Joining me is M. Sanjayan.
M. Sanjayan is here to tell us more.
The CEO of Conservation International.
Please say hello to Dr. M. Sanjayan, ladies and gentlemen.
We have been living on a changing planet for a long, long time. This change is just going to happen fast.
What's happening to our planet is a bigger threat than any disease. There's no question we've got a problem. Changes like this have brought down civilizations. What could this mean for us? Can you bring nature's voice to the table and change the way we live? Every year, we're a little closer to solving the puzzle.
We're building the future as we speak.
A future that thinks about alternate energies, reduces our carbon load. We can't rest. We have to keep the pressure up.
Fairness is not the way to frame it. The way to frame it is a competition to the top.
24 countries managed to grow their economy while reducing their emissions. We know we can do this. We have to do it. This next generation is demanding this.
Thank you. Every time Kandi puts one of these videos, it impresses me because I'm like, wow, this is pretty beautifully done. Thank you so much for the Harvard Alumni Club for inviting me here, and to all of you, and for this amazing hotel to host us all here today. So, you wanted a big idea to kick this off with, and so I'm going to start by proposing one. And the idea is this: can nations grow the way forests do? That should be the title of my talk. Can nations grow the way forests do? So I'll give you the 60 or 90-second highlight of what I'm going to say. For most of human history, progress was slow enough that our cultures could keep up with that progress. Norms, belief systems, taboos, traditions. These were the original guardrails that kept human ambition in balance with the natural world. We protected what we depended upon long before laws or policies made us do so. Then came the scientific revolution in the 16th, 17th century, and then the industrial revolution shortly after that. And innovation began moving faster than culture could evolve. For the first time in the human history, in the history of our species, we built economies that could scale much quicker than our values, that could scale much quicker than our ethics, that could scale much quicker than nature could replenish itself. And in that gap, the gap between innovation and wisdom, we stopped treating nature as our planet's infrastructure. We started treating it as an excess at best and hostile at worst. Now, the cost of that decision is not actually environmental. The cost really is economic, it's national, and it's now. The flip side is that to readdress that breakdown also provides us with opportunities for jobs, for economic growth, and of course for climate resilience, resource security, and the new bioeconomy. I think Sri Lanka is on that crossroad, making that decision, whether consciously or unconsciously, about which path it takes. So let me give you some examples and sort of build this idea out. So take something like the bow and arrow. The bow and arrow has been with us for about 70,000 years. The first example of a bow and arrow pops up in South Africa, I think about 72,000 years ago. That's a long time. And for about that time, for about 72,000 years, really up to about 500 years ago, the bow and arrow was a preeminent technology. Think about that. For 70,000 years, we had this one amazing technological leap and innovation. And there were differences in these different bows that people used, from the early bows that were used in southern Africa to the long bows used, in the battles in England and in Europe. But essentially, a bow and arrow looks like a bow and arrow. And if I showed you a bow and arrow from 70,000 years ago or from 500 years ago in medieval England, you'd recognize that technology. You'd all recognize a bow and arrow if I showed it to you. That's kind of an amazing thing, that this huge technology has remained almost exactly the same, right? And the people who built these things did that without physics, without engineering skills, without math skills, without most of the things that we today use for innovation and for building. That pause, that 70,000 years time frame that we had in order to get used to this technological innovation, gave culture time to catch up. So we had innovation, we had plenty of time for culture to evolve to catch up to it. The space allowed us humans to build the belief systems, our rituals, our taboos, our norms of action that protected nature long before science could explain why it mattered. There are lots of guardrails like this around the world, right? So sacred forests that you've heard of that are around temples or around stupas. That is basically a modern biodiversity bank. Fishing taboos, taboos that protect particular areas or close certain areas to fishing. That's basically sustainable yield science. Rivers that are treated with spiritual reverence, our watershed protection efforts. And here in Sri Lanka, if you think about the tank cascade systems that were created in the 4th century and expanded, in Polonnaruwa and the rest of the world, it's a pretty amazing system, something like 18,000 tanks that were built, all interconnected, all creating, 2.5% of the country's surface area really covered by water. That was an amazing invention of hydrology, right? And hydrological engineering. So we protected nature using all these normal systems and cultural systems, not because we studied them or particularly understood the science behind it. We didn't not always fully understand how they all worked. But for the most of human history, because we belonged to nature, we saw ourselves a part of it, and we had the time to modify and evolve, we created a system that kept us to some degree in balance with nature. We sort of grew with nature, and our needs grew alongside of it. Then we have, really in the last, say, 500 years, what I would call the great unmooring, where we cut our bounds from nature in a pretty fundamental way. And it really did happen in Western Europe. There's lots of reasons why it happened there. We don't need to go into that. But it really happened with the advent of sort of what we consider modern science. So people like Copernicus and Galileo and Francis Bacon and then Newton, right? If you actually think about Newton, right, and you think about a bow and arrow, so Newton's 3 laws of gravity are all expressed in the bow and arrow. Right? Law number 1, an arrow in flight will remain in flight until gravity acts upon it. That's Newton's first law. And law number 2, the force with which an arrow will hit the target is equal to its mass times its acceleration. That's Newton's second law. And Newton's third law is every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Right? So we had these principles that were built into this technology, but we didn't understand the science behind it. And because we didn't fully appreciate the science behind it, the ability for us to then innovate and scale solutions, to take one idea and apply it in a different field, just did not really exist. Recently, a guy by the name of Joel Moyker from Northwestern University, anyone heard of him? He won the Nobel Prize in economics this year. And he won the Nobel Prize for basically this idea. Basically, he said that technology has this incredible power to disrupt economies. And it can disrupt economies in dramatic and positive ways if we understand the science behind it. So that ability for a technology to really scale and disrupt in positive ways really only exists if the underlying physics or underlying science is fully understood. And that's sort of what we see today. So to put it very simply, we had gone from, during that time of the Industrial Revolution, we basically severed the consequences of our decision making. We began designing economies on top of nature, not within nature. Forests, rivers, reefs, once central to culture, identity, and governance, were now reduced to line items. Nature started shifting from infrastructure of our planet, to an asset, and then to an externality. And today, we really do treat it as an externality. Sri Lanka has done this for a long time. And when something becomes an externality, we all stop pricing it until at some point the bill arrives. And often when that bill arrives, it's paid by the poorest or under very dire circumstances. So, kind of leads me to my sort of second point here. Nature is not, by the way, I should have mentioned this, if you want to think about that bow and arrow and you think about your phone, right? So this is really amazing when you start thinking about it. So we had 70,000 years to get used to the bow and arrow. The iPhone does it in about 10 years. So that reduction, you really see that scale of how quickly, something now comes and we accept it and it becomes part of culture. Right? Everyone's like this on the phone. Yesterday, as I was pulling into this driveway, we almost hit a guy because he was on his phone walking like this. Just really came close to hitting him. And the driver yelled at him and he didn't even pay attention. And I'm thinking about that, like going, wow, within 10 years or so, maybe 15 years at max, all of a sudden this technology has just become so, we have to adapt to it so rapidly. Like never in human history have we done that. So that brings me to my third point, which is nature should be seen as infrastructure and not really seen as scenery. So when you think about conservation, you think about protecting nature, most people still think about it as doing something nice, doing something philanthropic, doing something charitable. You're protecting it for nature's sake or protecting it for the scenery, but really it shouldn't be. It should really be seen as infrastructure. And let me give you just a few examples of that. If you take a coral reef from this part of the world, it's not really scenery, it's a breakwater, it's a protein supply, it's a tourism engine, and it's an insurance policy. If you take a country like the Maldives, 1,000 islands, they're literally built on coral reefs. That country just doesn't exist without reef building that happens from coral reefs. And if you want to put a number to it, something like 20% of the GDP of the Maldives comes from tourism that's based entirely on its reef system, and another 20% comes from fisheries. And some people have estimated that the Maldives, has about, 8% of reduction in risk from catastrophic storms because of those reefs. In Belize, on the other side of the world, the reef, the Mesoamerican reef that protects Belize, is estimated to bring about $230 million a year into the economy in terms of avoided storm damage. That's a real number that the Belizean government has put on it and have now managed to sort of monetize it. Take mangroves, another thing that's quite frequent in our part of the world. In Bangladesh, you see something like 90% or higher reduction in storm damages because of mangroves. To the point now that every earthen dam that is built in mangrove, every dike, every structure that is built to protect villages or communities from storms by law, have to have mangroves embedded within them as a way of keeping them so stronger and safer and really providing insurance for those communities. Or you take forests and watersheds, for example. Here in Sri Lanka, I gave you the example of the Central Highlands that feeds the entire country, the tea industry, hydro, and irrigation, of course. But you go to the other side of the world and take something like the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal, unlike the Suez Canal, is a freshwater canal. So it entirely depends on fresh water in order to operate. Every ship that passes through the Panama Canal between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, or vice versa, uses about 52 million gallons of fresh water. It's the equivalent of something like 100 Olympic-sized swimming pools, right, for every ship. And in a day, something like 35 to 40 ships pass through the Panama Canal. The value that that provides the country is about $5 billion a year. About $250 billion worth of goods go in and out of the country. The country itself monetizes from its freshwater supply and the forests that provide that fresh water, about $5 billion a year. So when nature's infrastructure fails, economies don't just shake, they can actually break. Probably the biggest example of an under-realized sort of economic potential of nature is in the Amazon. Now, right now, there's a very big conference going on in Brazil, COP30, that really is bringing focus to the Amazon. But if you really wonder how much do people miss the importance of the Amazon, let me give you this figure. This actually kind of shocked me. So it turns out that for every person who lives in the Amazon, so there's about 28 million people live in the Amazon, the destruction of the Amazon, the clearing of the Amazon, mostly for cattle farming or agriculture, for soy production, right? Where they burn it and they clear cut it, puts out emissions. And on a per capita basis, the emissions for every citizen who lives in the Amazon is equivalent to a citizen living in Qatar. 33 tons of carbon emitted per person per year, on par with Qatar. The difference, of course, is in Qatar, the average citizen has about $79,000 in per capita income, whereas in the Amazon, it's under $5,000. There's no other place, literally on the planet, no country, or no region, I should say, Amazon's not a country, it's a region, right? No region in the world emits so much emission and has produced so little wealth for its people than the Amazon region. It's off the charts, quite an amazing thing. Now, reverse that and say, well, how much does the Amazon actually protect? There's about 400 billion trees in the Amazon. They're all sucking in carbon dioxide. And if you put a value to that, The Economist had an article on this recently, the value that is put on that, conservatively put on that, is $3 trillion. So the Amazon is basically doing $3 trillion worth of work on behalf of all of us and on behalf of the planet. How big is that? It's bigger than Apple. It's bigger than Apple. How big is it? It's actually bigger than Amazon, the company, whose market cap is about 2.6 billion today, right? 2.6 trillion today. There's only really one or two companies that are bigger than that. One of them is NVIDIA. NVIDIA has been around for, 20 years? Something along those lines. Amazon's been around for a long, long, long time. So I'm going to take a bet on something in the future, probably going to bet on the Amazon more than what is still essentially a very brand new industry, right? That's pretty an amazing thing if you really look at the value that it provides. So when nature collapses, entire economies can collapse, and we're seeing that. The fastest economic collapse today is actually water collapse. That's the fastest economic collapse that you're seeing today. Look at what's going on in Tehran. Tehran's a huge city. They're completely out of water today. I don't mean like a little bit out of water or water rationing. They're completely out. They're down to 3%. Half the dams that supply Tehran, I think there's something like 19 dams that supply Tehran, half of them have no water at all. Zip. The president of Iran very recently made headline news by saying that Tehran might have to be evacuated. He got a lot of pushback for that, and people got upset with him for saying something so radical. But that is the reality that he's facing. Or take Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world, maybe the largest city in the world. So you got Mexico City, which was built on a lake during the time of the Aztec Empire. The entire city was protected by this lake. They had canals that brought water in and took all the waste out because it's sort of in a bowl. Today, that lake is entirely gone. During the time of the conquistadors, they actually drained that lake as a way of colonizing the people, and then they kept it up for a couple of hundred years, and you have what you have today in Mexico City. So Mexico City is in such dire straits, they have to pump water in, right? They have to get it over the mountain and pump it in, but equally problematic, they have to actually pump sewage, wastewater. They have to actually pump it also out. So they have a double whammy. They've got to do it in two different directions. Mexico City is the only city in the world that actually employs what's called waste divers. These are divers, scuba divers, who are employed by the city to dive into the sewers in order to unplug them or unclog them when things like cars or dead bodies or, horses get stuck in there. I mean, they literally employ these people to be able to do that. Without that, the entire city just sort of collapses. Lack of water and overwhelmingness of sewage. And some parts of the city are sinking at the rate of about 50 centimeters, right? Half a meter a year. Which is quite dramatic if you think about building it. It's within your lifetime, you're seeing dramatic changes happen. So you you think, well, listen, we have to develop and we have to produce, so it's understandable that humans, we can't protect everything. How much is enough? Like, how much should we produce? How much should we protect? You think about agriculture, right? So one of the big reasons people have for destroying nature, undermining nature, is because of agricultural production. And it's true. If you want to grow something, you've got to clear land. No other way to do it. So if you have a country that is entirely intact, then you have zero agricultural productivity. So you start clearing some land, and you grow something, and your productivity goes up. Now, does it keep going up the more you clear? You'd think it does, but it actually doesn't. This is actually kind of an amazing thing. You can look at countries across the world. You can take every country in the world and plot out how much do they produce agricultural productivity, and how much land have they cleared in order to produce it. And what you find is that initially, yes, of course, as you clear land and you plant, you start increasing your production. But it levels off. And then after it levels off, it actually starts declining. Where adding another acre of land that you're clearing in order to grow actually overall reduces overall productivity. Not per hectare productivity or per acre productivity, but actual overall, total cumulative productivity actually starts to decline. So what's the number you say? It's around 48%, somewhere between 40 and 50% of clearing. Once you pass that threshold, clearing one more acre of land actually doesn't give you a per capita increase in yield. It actually creates a net reduction in yield. It's an extraordinary thing if you actually look at that number, right? So there's absolute limits, and you can show those limits based on every country in the world if you can plot this out. So the question is no longer, can we afford to protect nature? The question we really have to face is, can we afford not to do that? And there's a flip side, as I said, to this, right? The idea that when natures thrive, economies can thrive, have also been seized upon by some countries to think ahead of the curve. So in places like Costa Rica has doubled its forest cover in about 30 years, doubled it. And tourism economy now in Costa Rica is about 10% of the GDP. That really didn't exist 50 years ago in Costa Rica. Now it's a major part of its economy, partly because of what it's done with nature. In the Seychelles, in the Indian Ocean, Seychelles did the world's first debt for nature swap. So they took some of their sovereign debt and they renegotiated that debt for a lower rate, backed by international development banks and by private philanthropy. And because they got a lower rate now that they're paying on that debt, that difference they could now put towards protecting their oceans. That is a tool that has been used by many countries. It could certainly be used here in Sri Lanka as well. Take a country like Rwanda, a country that went through appalling amounts of civil strife and civil war, right, and genocide. Gorillas are a mainstay of the Rwandan economy today. In fact, Rwanda is a highly, highly populated, dense country with every square meter of land almost cultivated or someone's living on. But they've actually managed to expand habitat for gorillas because it's such a net draw to the country and to the country's economy. In Bhutan, they measure prosperity is measured right alongside natural capital. And in Namibia, a country where I spent some of my early years working, community conservancies have turned wildlife into direct income for indigenous and local people. So the key point there is nature is not the beneficiary of a strong economy. Nature can actually be the engine of a strong economy. And there's a new financial architecture now emerging on the global scene that provides some new tools that we can apply to protecting, restoring, and monetizing nature. protecting nature now is a profitable activity. It's not just symbolic. So I told you about what Seychelles did with a debt for nature swap. So when a country has sovereign debt, like Sri Lanka has, and they're paying a very high interest rate on that debt, it is very possible today, like really quite possible today, for that part of that debt to be renegotiated, as long as you have someone who's backing it up. And when it comes to nature protection, there are plenty of organizations and banks who are willing to do that. So you can renegotiate some of that debt. You're not incurring more debt. You're just getting a better rate for it. So if you go from 9% interest rate to 5% interest rate, the savings you're making can be put into social enterprises, into social good, like protecting nature, like education, like healthcare. And several countries have gone through this. Ecuador did it 2 years ago for the Galapagos Islands. It was one of the largest debt swaps in the world. $660 million of Ecuadorian debt was renegotiated. And with that reduced terms of payment, they have enough money forever to protect the Galapagos Islands in perpetuity. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary tool that can be used today. Blue and green bonds are increasingly popular around the world, where nature is treated like an infrastructure, and you can issue a bond around it. Fiji, Indonesia are countries that are using this. The carbon market, something that Sri Lanka has talked about but not really leaned into. In places like Kenya, for example, or even Indonesia, Brazil, Colombia, countries are paying, essentially, or businesses are paying Kenya to keep its carbon in the ground, right? It's a fantastic source of income because of the global good those countries are doing. Reef insurance, where coral reefs are treated as insurance, just like you would treat a bridge or a highway. And then you can get into some more speculative things like crypto or stable coins, where you create a coin that is backed by a natural asset, like hydro or like of a country's forests. Right? Now that's still more speculative. It's fine, but I'm giving you sort of the broad spectrum of tools that were not available when I got into conservation and that have emerged, I would say, in the last maybe 5 to 6 years that are now being used by countries around the world that people in Sri Lanka and South Asia could also start to apply in a local context. Now, the good news for Sri Lanka is that it's not really catching up. In some ways, Sri Lanka is a little bit ahead of the curve, in some ways. This country is not always behind the curve, especially when it comes to nature. So we've got lots of things going for us here in Sri Lanka. I mean, take something as simple as single-use plastic ban. You know, it's an extraordinary thing when you come here. If you go to the beach right here in Gulface, you don't really see much plastic. It's a really pretty incredible thing. I mean, I've gone to maybe 40 countries, 50 countries, really in every continent. And it's a remarkable thing, particularly in Asia, to go to a beach and not be inundated in plastic. Remarkable. And that's happened in just a few decades. That's just a small symbolic thing. But clean coastlines are visible proof that people are willing to make choices and governments are willing to compel those choices. You know, we have a massive amount of natural capital, all tucked into a small geography, from water to forests to fisheries. Like, this country has it, and it has it in abundance too. Even biodiversity, it's incredibly biodiverse, all packed into a very small country. And then we still have cultural memory that's still alive, right? It's in all of our cultures, that reverence, the acceptance of nature within our lives, within our religions, within our cultural practices is still very much alive here, where in many places it has entirely disappeared. And then, of course, as Kandivan mentioned, strategic importance and strategic location. When you're located where you're located, as this country is, I would say Sri Lanka isn't preparing for the future. In some ways, it's previewing its future. Let me close by giving you a little personal aside here. You know, I hadn't been back to Sri Lanka for many years, and I came back last March, and I came back with my daughter, who is now 6, but she was 5 at the time, and she had never been to Sri Lanka, so this was the first time me bringing her back to sort of the country of her heritage. I grew between continents. I didn't grow up here. But nature was a constant teacher for me. And when my daughter came here to Sri Lanka, I felt that she felt it immediately. She felt like this was home. And even now she refers to it with some level of reverence to home. Not through words, but she saw this in the coastlines, she saw this in the forests, in the wildlife, in the food, in the people, in systems that are working quietly and in the background. When a nation embeds nature into its design, even a child can feel it without being told. My thesis for you here today is to imagine Sri Lanka and to think about building a nation and using a forest as a model for nation building. A nation that grows like a forest prioritizes roots over its skylines. It prioritizes resilience over speed and scale, diversity over monoculture, interdependence over extraction, time horizons longer than a single election cycle, and wealth that compounds through time rather than collapses. Forests never ask how to be sustainable. They just ask how to stay alive. The next economic frontier will not be mined. It will be financed from natural systems that already exist. Nations that understand this will not borrow from the future. They will end up owning it. Countries that grow like forests, I believe, will outlast, out-innovate, and out-thrive those that don't. And that is my sincere hope for Sri Lanka. Thank you.